Every aspiring merchant in the 14th century shared the exact same delusion. You stand on the muddy docks of Danzig, or Genoa, or Bruges, watching a massive oak cog slide into the harbor. Its broad, rounded hull sits deep in the water, heavy with Baltic rye, Flemish wool, or Syrian silk. You see a floating vault. You see a single journey that can multiply an investor's capital 3 times over in 90 days. You calculate the gross proceeds of 400 barrels of French wine sold to English lords who drink like fish and pay in silver coin. It looks like the ultimate wealth cheat code of the High Middle Ages, a monopoly on distance. A machine that converts ocean horizon into raw liquid silver. It wasn't. Owning a medieval merchant ship was not a business. It was a high-stakes game of Russian roulette, played with wooden planks, hemp rope, and human lives, orchestrated on top of an unmapped abyss. The economics were so brutally unstable that the entire modern financial system, from double-entry bookkeeping and maritime insurance to fractional equity and joint stock corporations, had to be invented specifically to stop merchant ship owners from going utterly broke on their first voyage. To understand how you lose your shirt on the high seas, you first have to buy the asset. And in the late Middle Ages, a deep-water merchant vessel was the equivalent of a heavy commercial aircraft. You didn't just walk into a shipyard and buy a ship off the lot. You commissioned a capital-intensive engineering project from a closed guild of shipwrights who guarded their timber formulas like state secrets. For a modest coastal trader, a 20-ton Ballinger might set you back 40 pounds silver. But if you wanted to play the big game, if you wanted to run the long-distance trade routes of the Hanseatic League or the Venetian Maritime Empire, you needed a cog or a carrack. A 300-ton Hanseatic cog built from seasoned Baltic oak required over 300 mature trees, tens of thousands of iron rivets forged by hand, pitch boiled from Scandinavian pine, and acres of woven flax for the sails. Total initial capital expenditure for the bare hull, rigging, and basic fittings, anywhere from 300 to 600 pounds silver. In an era where a skilled master stonemason earned about 5 pounds a year, buying a top-tier merchant ship was equivalent to an 80-year wage investment. If you didn't have that kind of capital, you took out a bottomry loan. This was the ancient ancestor of high-yield debt. A financier lent you the money to build or buy the ship, secured entirely against the vessel itself. If the ship returned safely to port, you paid back the principal, plus a staggering interest rate, often 20 to 35%, to compensate the lender for the risk. If the ship sank, the loan was completely canceled. The financier took the loss, and you walked away with your life, assuming you survived the swim. If you scaled up to a 400-ton Venetian carrack meant for the lucrative spice runs to Alexandria, the price tag exploded past 1,000 pounds. Very few individuals owned a ship outright. Instead, ship ownership was sliced into fractional shares called carracks or partes. A single ship might have 16, 32, or 64 individual owners. The shipwright, the merchant, the captain, a local bishop, and a wealthy widow who invested her inheritance. Slicing ownership didn't just pool capital. It was the world's first formal attempt at risk diversification. You didn't own one ship that could sink and destroy your family bloodline. You owned 1/16 of 16 different ships spread across the Mediterranean and the North Sea. Once the hull was launched, you entered the operational meat grinder. The core revenue model of a merchant vessel sounds simple. Buy commodities where they are abundant and cheap, load them into your hold, sail to where they are scarce and expensive, and pocket the price spread. Consider the classic Baltic trade route. You load a cog in Reval with timber, wax, and rye. You sail through the dangerous Danish straits to London or Bruges. There, grain is in short supply because of crop failures or endless feudal wars. You sell the grain at a 300% markup. With the silver proceeds, you buy fine English woolens, Flemish cloth, and barrels of salted herring. You sail back to the Baltic and sell those manufactured goods to Slavic princes who lack textile industries. On paper, the margins look insane. A single successful run could yield a net return of 50 to 80% on invested capital. But the moment you look at operational metrics, the illusion vanishes. First, there is the ratio of deadweight tonnage to payload efficiency. A medieval ship was an insanely drag-heavy vessel. A heavy oak hull needed substantial ballast, usually tons of cobblestones dumped into the bottom of the ship just to stay upright when empty. Second, cargo space was aggressively cannibalized by survival necessities. A crew of 20 to 30 sailors on a 2-month voyage required enormous quantities of freshwater barrels, hardtack biscuit, salted pork, and firewood for the cooking hearth. Up to 20% of your usable internal cubic volume was eaten up, just keeping the crew alive long enough to reach the destination. Then came the insider metrics that governed your daily cash burn. The most critical metric for a medieval shipowner was not top-line revenue, but laytime and demurrage. Laytime was the number of days allowed for loading and unloading cargo in port. Every single day your ship sat tied to a wooden pier in Bruges or Venice was a day you were paying harbor dues, city taxes, and crew wages while generating zero revenue. If the port was congested, or if local customs officials held up your paperwork demanding bribes, you entered demurrage, a financial bleed rate where dock fees and spoilage costs stripped away your projected profit margin by 2 to 3% per day. Worst of all was the yield to spoilage ratio. If you were carrying grain, damp sea air and bilge water could rot 30% of your cargo before you ever sighted land. Weevils ate the flour. Rats chewed through the grain sacks. If you were carrying wine or beer, temperature swings in the hold could turn hundreds of gallons of expensive booze into worthless vinegar overnight. You were not just racing against the wind. You were racing against biological decay. The physical construction of a medieval ship was a masterclass in compromise and hidden vulnerabilities. It was an ecosystem designed to trap water, rot wood, and invite destruction. If you looked inside the dark hold of a clinker-built or carvel-built vessel, you saw a structure under constant structural stress. Ships were built using green timber that hadn't fully dried, joined together with wooden pegs called trunnels and iron nails. The moment a ship hit rough seas, the heavy oak planks flexed and twisted. The oakum, a mixture of old hemp fibers and boiling pine tar pounded between the planks to keep the ship watertight, constantly worked its way loose. Every medieval ship leaked, constantly. Water seeped through the hull seams, pooled in the bilge at the very bottom of the vessel, and mixed with discarded food, dead rats, and human waste. This created a toxic, acidic slurry called bilge water. Bilge water didn't just smell foul enough to knock a sailor unconscious. The acid in the water rapidly rusted the iron nails holding the hull frames together. To keep the ship from settling lower into the water and sinking under its own weight, the crew had to operate primitive wooden suction pumps or haul heavy leather buckets out of the hold 24 hours a day. If your crew grew exhausted, or if the bilge pumps jammed with loose grain and rotted rope, the water level in the hold rose. An extra foot of water in the hold added tons of unstable weight, reducing the vessel's freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the main deck, and drastically increasing the chances of capsizing in a sudden squall. Furthermore, the design of medieval ports was a psychological and financial trap. Many major medieval harbors lacked deep-water docks. Ships had to anchor offshore in exposed roadsteads and pay local lightermen, small boat operators, to transfer cargo piece by piece from the ship to the shore. These local boatmen operated localized monopolies. They charged extortionate rates to offload your goods. If you refused to pay their prices, your cargo sat in the hold, rotting under the summer sun while your crew consumed your remaining provisions. You were completely at the mercy of localized infrastructure parasites. If the operational headaches didn't bankrupt you, the systemic risks of medieval maritime trade were waiting to finish the job. A merchant ship owner operated in an environment completely devoid of reliable weather forecasting, modern navigation, or international law. The first lethal trap was structural over-leverage combined with natural disaster. Consider the historical reality of the Great Storm of 1287, or the fierce gales that plagued the English Channel every winter. A shipowner who leveraged his entire fortune to buy and load 2 large cogs could see his entire net worth wiped out in 45 minutes on the sandbars of the Goodwin Sands or the rocky coast of Britain. If the weather didn't destroy your vessel, human predators did. Piracy in the Middle Ages was not an anomaly. It was a recognized, semi-legitimate business enterprise. In the Baltic and North Seas, organized pirate fleets like the Victual Brothers roamed freely, raiding Hanseatic shipping lines, capturing vessels, slaughtering crews, and selling the stolen goods in sympathetic ports. And then there was the legal hazard known as the right of wreck and the letter of marque, under medieval maritime law in many coastal European regions. If a ship ran aground or hit a reef, any cargo washed ashore automatically became the legal property of the local feudal lord. Coastal lords frequently set up fake signal fires on cliffs to deliberately lure merchant ships onto the rocks, waiting like vultures to scavenge the wreckage and claim the legal salvage rights. If a merchant from your city defaulted on a debt to a merchant in another country, the aggrieved city-state might issue a letter of marque. This legal document authorized local sailors to seize any ship originating from your home port to satisfy the debt. You could sail into a foreign harbor with a perfectly legitimate cargo, only to have your ship impounded, your crew thrown into a dungeon, and your goods auctioned off because a guy who lived 3 streets away from you in Hamburg didn't pay his bills in Flanders. Case Study 1. The Baltic Rye Disaster of 1412. A syndicate of North German merchants leveraged their balance sheets to the absolute limit, buying 3 large cogs and filling them to the brim with Baltic grain destined for the starving cities of England during a severe winter shortage. They financed 90% of the voyage using short-term debt at 30% interest, assuming the sky-high English grain prices would allow them to pay off the loans and clear a 40% profit. As the fleet attempted to clear the narrow sound between Denmark and Sweden, an early Arctic freeze locked the Danish straits in solid ice. The ships were trapped in the ice pack for 3 months. By the time the spring thaw arrived, dampness had turned 80% of the rye into a toxic, moldy sludge. To make matters worse, the delay allowed local English farmers to harvest an early spring crop, crashing grain prices in London. The syndicate couldn't sell the rotted grain, defaulted on their bottomry loans, lost all 3 ships to foreign creditors, and the individual partners were thrown into debtors' prisons across Lubeck. Capital structure failure combined with timing mismatch. Case Study 2. The Venetian Galley Miscalculation of 1348. The Republic of Venice operated a state-controlled maritime system where the government built luxurious, highly defensible merchant galleys at the famous Arsenale and auctioned off the cargo space to private merchant cartels. In 1348, a group of wealthy Venetian patricians bid astronomical prices for the exclusive right to import eastern spices and luxury silks from the Black Sea port of Kaffa. They poured their fortunes into securing the fleet's cargo space. But when the galleys docked in Kaffa, they inadvertently loaded more than just silk and spices into their holds. They loaded the Black Death. By the time the ships returned to Italy, half the crews were dead, and the plague tore through the city of Venice, killing over half the population. The local economy completely collapsed. There was no market left to buy high-end silks or expensive spices. The merchant syndicate couldn't liquidate their inventory to pay the state for the galley leases. The luxury goods sat rotted and ruined in humid warehouses while the investors went bankrupt in a city transformed into a mass grave. Market mismatch caused by catastrophic black swan friction. When you stripped away the romantic mythology of setting sail into the sunset, the medieval merchant ship was not a vessel of adventure. It was a high-risk financial derivative constructed from wood, iron, and canvas. The true mathematical reality of owning a medieval merchant ship comes down to one fundamental equation. Net profit equals gross arbitrage spread, spoilage rate, minus demurrage, plus harbor bribes, plus debt interest plus protection costs. If your gross arbitrage spread was 50%, but spoilage took 20%, interest took 25%, and harbor dues took 10%, you were running a negative 5% net margin on an asset that had a 20% probability of ending up on the bottom of the ocean every single time it left port. On average, a well-managed, fractional share merchant ship operating on established, low-risk coastal routes yielded a long-term realistic net margin of just 6% to 12% annually. A pathetic risk-adjusted return when you consider that a single storm, pirate raid, or sudden outbreak of war could permanently reduce your capital asset to zero. The only institutions that built real, generational fortunes from medieval shipping were not the brave captains or the over-leveraged lone wolf merchants who gambled everything on a single voyage. The real winners were the institutional operators, the Hanseatic League in the north and the Republic of Venice in the south. Venice built an empire not by betting on individual ships, but by constructing a state-backed monopoly on infrastructure. They owned the shipyards, controlled the port facilities, regulated the insurance rates, dictated the trade laws, and deployed heavy naval warships to protect their commercial routes. They socialized the operational risks through state oversight, while extracting rents at every step of the supply chain. The system of medieval maritime commerce was never designed to turn a bold, ambitious individual into a wealthy tycoon. It was designed to extract maximum value from the movement of goods, while shifting the catastrophic physical and financial risks onto the shoulders of the ship owner. The builder sold the oak, the financier charged 30% interest, the local lord collected dock fees, the pirate took his cut, and the sea took the rest. The system was rigged for the institution that controlled the port, never for the poor soul holding the wheel in the middle of a storm.